The rain fell steadily outside the modest house in the small town, its rhythm matching the hollow thud in Emily's heart. She stood at the door, her fingers clenched tightly around her father's worn-out work gloves. Her eyes, red and swollen, stared blankly at the puddles forming on the ground, the tears on her cheeks mingling with the raindrops. Inside, the house was silent, a stark contrast to the usual warmth and laughter that had once filled it. The news of her father's accident had hit her like a sledgehammer, leaving her breathless and reeling. The accident was quick, they said, an unfortunate mishap that took him away without warning. Emily could still hear the words of the officer, his voice monotone and detached as if reciting a rehearsed speech. Her father was gone, and with him the light in her life had dimmed. Emily wandered through the house, each room a painful reminder of what she had lost. In the living room, his favorite armchair sat empty, the fabric worn where he used to rest his head. She ran her fingers over the armrest, feeling the indentations of his presence. The kitchen table, where they shared countless meals and stories, now seemed cold and uninviting. She could almost hear his laughter, the deep, hearty sound that always made her feel safe. Carol, her stepmother, moved around the house with an air of superficial concern. In the initial days, she had played the part of the grieving widow well, offering Emily words of comfort and pats on the back that felt hollow. But as the days passed, the facade began to crack. Emily noticed Carol's frequent phone calls, the way she would disappear into her room for hours. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next in a blur of rain and sorrow. Emily tried to find solace in her father's belongings, seeking out pieces of him in the objects he had left behind. She spent hours in his workshop, trying to finish the wooden box, her hands trembling as she worked. It was a slow process, each stroke of the chisel a small step towards preserving his memory. Carol's absence grew more pronounced. She was often out, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. When she was home, her presence was a cold shadow, her attempts at interaction perfunctory and devoid of genuine care. Emily began to see the truth beneath the surface, recognizing Carol's indifference, masked by a thin veneer of duty. One evening, as the rain hammered against the windows, Emily sat in the living room, the work gloves still in her hands. She stared at the photographs on the mantel, images of happier times. Her father's smiling face looked down at her, a reminder of the love and warmth that once filled their home. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a longing for the days when everything was simple and whole. The door creaked open, and Carol stepped in, shaking the rain from her coat. She glanced at Emily, her expression a mix of irritation and forced sympathy. "You should try to get some sleep," she said, her voice lacking warmth. "Dwelling on the past won't bring him back." Emily nodded numbly, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as Carol disappeared into her room, the door closing with a soft click. Alone again, Emily curled up on the couch, hugging the gloves to her chest. The rain continued its relentless patter, a mournful melody that echoed her grief. As the night deepened, Emily's thoughts turned to her father's voice, the way he used to sing her to sleep with soft, comforting words. She closed her eyes, imagining his arms around her, and whispered into the silence, "I miss you, Dad." The words hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the void that now filled her life. The house was eerily quiet as Emily fumbled through the nearly empty fridge. The cold light cast shadows over the sparse contents, an old loaf of bread, a half-empty jar of peanut butter, and a few wilted vegetables. Her stomach growled in protest, but she pushed it aside, cobbling together a makeshift sandwich. She missed the hearty meals her father used to cook, the way he'd hum a tune while stirring a pot on the stove. Sitting at the kitchen table, Emily took a bite of the dry sandwich, staring out the window at the gloomy weather. The days had become a monotonous blur of grey skies and cold indifference from Carol. Emily's once vibrant eyes now seemed dull, a reflection of the emptiness she felt inside. School was no refuge either. The once lively chatter in the hallways now felt like background noise, distant and disconnected. Emily trudged through the days, her mind fogged by grief. Her teachers, noticing the change, tried to reach out, but their efforts were met with little success. In Mr. Thompson's math class, Emily stared blankly at the numbers on the board. Equations that once made sense now seemed like a foreign language. Mr. Thompson, a kind but stern man, approached her desk quietly. "Emily, are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle yet probing. She looked up, meeting his concerned gaze with a blank expression. "I'm fine," she muttered, turning her attention back to the incomprehensible numbers. Mr. Thompson sighed, recognizing the wall she had built around herself. "If you need help or someone to talk to, my door is always open." She nodded, but the words felt empty, more like a formality than an offer of real help. In the lunchroom, Emily sat alone, picking at her food. Her classmates, once friends, now kept their distance, unsure of how to bridge the gap that her father's death had created. Whispers and sideways glances followed her wherever she went, a constant reminder of her altered reality. During history class, Mrs. Smith, a sympathetic woman with a warm demeanor, handed back an essay covered in red marks. Emily's heart sank as she saw the grade. She used to excel in history, finding solace in the stories of the past. Now, it was just another subject she couldn't connect with. "Emily, can we talk for a moment?" Mrs. Smith asked as the class filed out. Emily nodded, staying behind as her classmates left. She stood by Mrs. Jenkins's desk, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Your work has been slipping," Mrs. Smith said softly, concern etched in her features. "I know things have been hard since your father passed. If there's anything you need, please let me know." Emily felt a lump in her throat, but forced herself to speak. "Thank you, Mrs. Smith. I'll try to do better." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, but the sadness in her eyes mirrored Emily's own. At home, the pattern of neglect grew more evident. Carol's absences became longer, and when she was home, her presence was distant, preoccupied with her phone or out with friends. The facade of a grieving widow had worn thin, revealing a woman more concerned with her own life than the well-being of her stepdaughter. Emily's attempts to communicate were met with indifference. One evening, she approached Carol, who was sitting on the couch, engrossed in her phone. "Carol, we're out of groceries. Can we go shopping tomorrow?" Emily asked, her voice tentative. Carol barely glanced up. "I'll take care of it later," she said dismissively, her fingers flying over the screen. "But there's hardly anything left to eat," Emily persisted. Carol sighed, finally looking up with a hint of irritation. "I said I'll handle it, Emily. Now go do your homework or something." Emily retreated to her room, feeling more alone than ever. She sat at her desk, opening her history book, but the words swam before her eyes. The weight of everything was too much to bear. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. Inside Carol's modest house, the air was thick with tension. Emily sat in the corner of the living room, clutching her worn-out teddy bear, listening to the low murmur of Carol's voice as she spoke on the phone. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, a mixture of impatience and cold determination. "Yes, Michael, "She's still here," Carol said, her voice clipped. "I've told you before. I can't keep her." Emily's heart sank. She had overheard snippets of conversations like this before, but tonight it felt different, more urgent, more final. Carol's eyes flicked towards Emily, filled not with concern, but with calculation. The conversation continued and Carol's tone grew more businesslike. "We agreed on the terms, Michael. I expect you to hold up your end. I'll bring her over tomorrow evening." After hanging up, Carol's demeanor shifted. She glanced at Emily with a semblance of forced patience. "Pack your things," she said. "We're going on a little trip tomorrow." Emily didn't ask where they were going. She had learned that questions only led to frustration and vague answers. The night passed slowly, filled with a quiet dread. Emily packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, her mind racing with uncertainty. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carol drove Emily to the outskirts of town. They arrived at Michael's mansion, a grand structure surrounded by high gates and manicured lawns. The house loomed large and intimidating, a stark contrast to the modest home Emily had known. Michael greeted them at the door. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his demeanor controlled and unreadable. He offered a polite smile, but there was an air of detachment in his eyes. "Good evening, Carol." "Emily," he said, nodding to each of them. "Please, come in." Carol wasted no time. "Here she is, as agreed. I trust everything is in order." Michael nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's. "Of course. Emily, I'm sure you'll be comfortable here." Emily followed them inside, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and apprehension. The interior of the mansion was lavish, with high ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and luxurious furnishings. It was a world away from the simplicity of her previous home. Michael led them to a sitting room, where a fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. He turned to Emily, his expression softening slightly. "Are you hungry, Emily? Would you like something to eat?" Emily nodded hesitantly. "Yes, please." Michael called for the housekeeper, who soon appeared with a tray of sandwiches and a steaming bowl of soup. Emily sat down and began to eat, the warmth of the food providing a brief comfort amidst the uncertainty. Carol and Michael moved to a corner of the room, their voices low, but not completely inaudible. "Remember our agreement, Michael," Carol said, her tone firm. Their conversation continued, but Emily's focus shifted to the food in front of her. It was the first warm meal she'd had in days. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. After the meal, Michael showed Emily to her new room. It was spacious and elegantly furnished, with a large bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the gardens. He placed her suitcase on the bed and turned to her with a measured smile. "This is your room now, Emily. If you need anything, just let me know." Emily nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. She looked around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. It felt like stepping into a different world, one filled with luxury, but also a sense of isolation. Michael left her alone to settle in, and Emily unpacked her belongings, placing her teddy bear on the bed. She sat down, feeling the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. The reality of her situation began to sink in. She was now in the care of a stranger, in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. The evening passed slowly. Emily explored her new room, touched the smooth surfaces of the furniture, and stared out of the window at the expansive gardens. It was beautiful, but it felt distant, almost unreal. As night fell, Michael returned to check on her. He stood in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Is everything all right, Emily?" Do you need anything?" Emily shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." "Good," Michael replied. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I want you to feel comfortable here." With that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Emily lay down on the bed, clutching her teddy bear, her mind racing with thoughts of what the future might hold. Emily awoke to the soft glow of morning light streaming through the large windows of her new room. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, before the memory of yesterday came rushing back. She sat up in the enormous bed, the luxurious sheets feeling foreign against her skin. Her small suitcase sat in the corner, a stark contrast to the elegant furniture that filled the room. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet sinking into the plush carpet. As she stood, she ran her fingers over the smooth mahogany dresser, its surface polished to a gleam. Everything in the room seemed too perfect, too pristine. She felt out of place, like an intruder in a world she didn't belong to. The door creaked open, and Michael appeared, holding a tray with breakfast. "Good morning, Emily," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "I thought you might like to have breakfast in your room today." Emily nodded, giving him a tentative smile. "Thank you, Michael." He set the tray on the small table by the window, gesturing for her to sit. "I hope you slept well." Emily shrugged, taking a seat and looking at the spread before her. Fresh fruit, warm toast, and a steaming cup of tea. "It was all right," she replied, picking up a slice of toast. Michael sat across from her, his gaze thoughtful. "I know this must be a big adjustment for you. If there's anything you need or anything I can do to make you more comfortable, please let me know." She nodded, not trusting her voice to convey the jumble of emotions she felt. They ate in companionable silence, the only sound the clinking of utensils and the soft rustle of the curtains in the morning breeze. After breakfast, Michael suggested a tour of the mansion. Emily agreed, her curiosity piqued despite her lingering unease. As they walked through the grand hallways, she marveled at the intricate details of the architecture, the expensive paintings that lined the walls, and the exquisite furniture. She hesitated at the doorway of a room filled with bookshelves that reached the ceiling. "This is the library," Michael said, a note of pride in his voice. "You're welcome to read any book you like. If you need recommendations, I'd be happy to help." Emily's eyes widened as she stepped inside, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "It's beautiful," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Michael watched her with a soft smile. "I'm glad you think so. Reading can be a great comfort." They continued the tour, eventually stepping out into the expansive garden. The lush greenery and vibrant flowers were a stark contrast to the mansion's formal interior. Emily's eyes lit up as she took in the sight of the blooming roses, the neatly trimmed hedges, and the trickling sound of a nearby fountain. "This is my favorite place," Michael said, watching her reaction. "It's peaceful here." Emily wandered along the garden paths, her fingers brushing the petals of the flowers. She inhaled deeply, the scent of roses and fresh grass filling her senses. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a semblance of peace. Over the next few days, Emily began to explore her new surroundings more freely. She spent hours in the library, losing herself in the pages of adventure and fantasy novels. Michael often found her curled up in a chair, a book in her hands, and a look of concentration on her face. One evening, she returned to her room to find her old teddy bear sitting on her bed, its worn fabric carefully stitched back together. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, a lump forming in her throat. Michael appeared at the door, his expression unreadable. "I noticed your bear was a bit worse for wear," he said quietly. "I hope you don't mind, but I did some repairs." Emily looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the bear to her chest. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's no trouble. I just want you to feel at home here." The next day, Michael found her in the garden, watching the birds flit from tree to tree. She had a notebook in her lap, sketching the flowers and plants around her. He approached slowly, not wanting to disturb her. "Emily," he said softly, "would you like to help me plant some new flowers today?" She looked up, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "I'd love to." They spent the afternoon working side by side, planting colorful blooms and talking about everything and nothing. Michael shared stories of his travels, and Emily opened up about her favorite memories with her father. The garden seemed to come alive with their shared laughter and conversation. Emily was beginning to make it her home. The tranquility of Michael's mansion was shattered one morning by the sudden, insistent ringing of the doorbell. Michael opened the door to find Carol standing there, her posture rigid and her expression smug. Emily, who had been sitting in the living room with a book, felt her heart sink. She instinctively moved closer to Michael, seeking the safety his presence provided. "Good morning, Michael," Carol said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm here to take Emily home." Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. "Emily is home," he replied calmly but firmly. "She's staying here, Carol." Carol's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm her legal guardian. You can't just keep her here against my will." Emily, peeking out from behind Michael, felt a wave of panic. The idea of going back to Carol's neglectful care was unbearable. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "I think it's best if we discuss this with our lawyers present," Michael suggested, his voice steady. Carol's eyes flickered with annoyance. "Fine," she said. "I'll see you in court." The legal battle began in earnest. Michael's lawyer, John, a seasoned and determined professional, immediately set to work gathering testimonies and evidence. He spoke with neighbors who had witnessed Carol's neglect, teachers who had seen Emily's decline, and even former friends of Carol who were willing to testify about her disinterest in Emily's welfare. "Every detail matters," John said, his tone resolute as he sorted through the evidence in Michael's study. "We need to show the court the full picture." Michael nodded, appreciating John's thoroughness. "Emily deserves better," he said quietly. Meanwhile, Carol was busy manipulating her side of the story. She played the part of the concerned stepmother, visiting the school and speaking with anyone who would listen. Her crocodile tears and feigned concern were designed to paint her in the best possible light. The day of the court hearing arrived and the atmosphere was tense. Emily sat beside Michael, her small hand gripping his for support. Carol entered the courtroom, her eyes glinting with confidence. The judge, a stern-faced woman with an air of authority, took her seat and called the proceedings to order. Emily sat beside Michael, her small frame nearly swallowed by the oversized wooden bench. She clutched her teddy bear tightly, the worn fabric offering a semblance of comfort amidst the chaos. John stood at the front, his posture confident as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, we will present evidence today to show that Emily's best interests are served by remaining in Michael's care," he began, his voice steady. "We will hear from those who have witnessed firsthand the neglect she has suffered and the positive changes she has experienced under Michael's guardianship." The first witness, Mrs. Reynolds, a neighbor from down the street, took the stand. She was a kindly woman, her face etched with concern. "I've seen how Carol treated Emily," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The poor girl was often left alone, looking hungry and neglected. It was heartbreaking. The judge, her expression stern, nodded and made notes. Emily watched the judge's reactions carefully, searching for any sign of understanding or empathy. Next, Mr. Thompson, Emily's math teacher, approached the stand. His testimony was measured but filled with genuine worry. Emily's performance in school plummeted after her father's death, he explained. When she moved in with Michael, I saw a significant improvement. She started engaging in class again, and her grades went up. As Mr. Thompson spoke, Carol's lawyer attempted to object, but the judge waved him off, her interest piqued by the teacher's observations. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she said, signaling for the next witness. The final witness, Ms. Jenkins, an old housemaid who had worked for Carol briefly, stepped forward. Her testimony was perhaps the most damning. "I worked in Carol's house for a few months," she recounted. "Carol often left Emily to fend for herself while she went out. The girl was like a ghost in that house, barely seen and never heard." The judge's frown deepened, and she turned her gaze to Carol, whose face was a mask of controlled fury. Carol's attempts to discredit the witnesses were clumsy and transparent, her frustration evident in her clenched fists and sharp glances. Finally, it was Michael's turn to take the stand. He stood tall, his presence calm and resolute. "Your Honor, Emily is not just a responsibility to me. She is family. I have done everything in my power to provide her with a stable and loving home." He paused, glancing at Emily, who was clutching her teddy bear even tighter, her eyes filled with hope. "Under my care, Emily has thrived. She's excelling in school again, participating in activities, and, more importantly, she's beginning to heal from the trauma she's experienced." The courtroom was silent, the weight of Michael's words hanging in the air. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Michael," she said, finally, turning her attention to Carol. Carol's lawyer scrambled to regain control, calling Carol to the stand. She played her part well, tears streaming down her face as she spoke of her love for Emily. But the judge's eyes remained cold, unimpressed by the performance. "Your Honor, I've always wanted what's best for Emily," Carol insisted, but her words rang hollow against the testimonies of neglect and abandonment. As Carol continued to speak, the judge's patience wore thin. The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on the judge as she prepared to deliver her verdict. Emily sat close to Michael, her heart pounding in her chest. The days leading up to this moment had been filled with anxiety and fear. Carol's accusations had been relentless, each one more outrageous than the last. Carol's lawyer stood, a smug look on his face. "Your Honor, my client claims that Michael only took Emily in for selfish reasons. He even paid for her, treating her like property. This so-called guardian has no genuine interest in Emily's well-being." Carol stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with false righteousness. "He bought her like a slave, Your Honor. He has no right to keep her." Michael stood up, his face calm, but his eyes burning with determination. "Your Honor, I need to clarify what really happened. Yes, there was a transaction, but it was not to buy Emily. It was a desperate act to save her. I've seen firsthand how Carol treated her, like a burden, neglected and unloved. The money was a means to get Emily out of a toxic environment." He turned to the judge, his voice steady and heartfelt. "Emily is not a possession. She's a child who deserves love and care. She's become like a daughter to me, and I want nothing more than to see her happy and thriving." The judge looked from Michael to Carol, her expression unreadable. She then turned to Emily, who clutched her teddy bear tightly, her eyes filled with silent pleas. "Emily," the judge said softly, "I need to hear from you. Do you feel safe with Michael? Do you want to stay with him?" Emily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor, Michael has been kind to me. I feel safe with him. He treats me like family." The judge's eyes softened as she looked at the frightened girl. She took a deep breath and turned her attention back to the courtroom. After reviewing all the evidence and hearing the testimonies, it is clear that Emily's best interests are served by remaining in Michael's care. The court grants full custody to Michael and condemns Carol for her neglect and abuse. A wave of relief washed over Michael, his shoulders sagging as the tension left his body. Emily let out a small sob of joy, her tears spilling over as she looked up at him. He knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you so much." Michael held her close, his own eyes damp. "You're safe now, Emily. We're going home." As they left the courthouse, the weight of the past month seemed to lift. Outside, the sun was shining, a symbol of the new beginning they were about to embark on. Emily clung to Michael, her sense of safety and relief palpable. At home, the process of healing began. Michael was patient and gentle, giving Emily the space she needed to open up. Each day brought small steps forward. Emily laughing at a joke, sharing her thoughts at dinner, or asking for help with her homework. The mansion, once a place of intimidation, slowly became a sanctuary filled with warmth and care. One evening, as they sat in the garden, Emily looked up at Michael, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I love it here," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." Michael smiled, his heart full. "I love having you here, Emily. You're family now." The journey ahead was still long, but they faced it together, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The shadows of the past were fading, replaced by the light of hope and the promise of a brighter future. Emily had found her home, and in Michael she had found a father who loved her unconditionally. The mansion was filled with a quiet hum of activity. Emily stood in the large foyer, looking down at her new ballet slippers. The polished floors of Michael's mansion gleamed, and she could see her reflection in them, a small figure poised at the brink of something new. She took a deep breath, clutching her dance bag tightly. "Ready for your first class?" Michael's voice broke the silence, filled with gentle encouragement. Emily nodded, her heart racing. "I think so," she whispered. Michael's eyes softened. "You'll do great. Just remember to enjoy it." At the dance studio, Emily hesitated at the door, peeking in at the other students warming up. The instructor, Ms. Harper, noticed her and walked over with a welcoming smile. "You must be Emily. Come on in. We're just getting started." Emily took a tentative step inside, feeling Michael's reassuring presence behind her. Ms. Harper guided her to a spot, and the music began. At first, Emily's movements were stiff, her limbs awkward and uncertain. She glanced at the other girls, their grace and confidence highlighting her own self-doubt. But as the class progressed, something shifted. The rhythm of the music seeped into her bones, and she started to lose herself in the dance. Her steps became more fluid, her movements more expressive. Michael watched from the doorway, a proud smile spreading across his face. After class, Ms. Harper approached Michael. She did wonderfully for her first day. There's a natural grace in her movements. Michael's smile widened. "Thank you, Ms. Harper. I'm very proud of her." Emily beamed, the words of praise boosting her confidence. As they walked back to the car, she felt lighter, as if the dance had lifted some of the heaviness from her heart. The following week, Emily started her painting classes. The art room was a bright, airy space filled with easels and canvases. The scent of fresh paint and the soft buzz of creative energy made it feel like a sanctuary. Emily approached her canvas with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Her instructor, Mr. Davis, handed her a palette of colors. "Just let your feelings guide you, Emily. There's no right or wrong in art." Emily nodded, dipping her brush into the vibrant hues. At first, her strokes were tentative, but as she relaxed, the colors began to flow more freely. She painted scenes from her imagination, blending reality and dreams in a kaleidoscope of emotions. Michael visited the art room often, watching Emily's progress with a sense of wonder. He celebrated her achievements, no matter how small, with heartfelt words and quiet gestures of encouragement. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Michael handed her a small, wrapped package. "What's this?" Emily asked, curiosity lighting up her eyes. "Open it and see," Michael replied, his eyes twinkling. Inside, she found a set of high-quality paintbrushes. "I thought you might like to have your own set," Michael said, his voice filled with warmth. Emily's eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them away, smiling brightly. "Thank you, Michael. They're perfect." As the weeks turned into months, Emily's confidence grew. She danced with more freedom, her movements reflecting the joy that was slowly returning to her life. In the art room, her paintings became bolder, more vibrant, each one a testament to her healing spirit. Michael watched her transformation with a heart full of pride. He marveled at her resilience, her ability to find beauty and grace even after all she had been through. Their home was filled with her artwork, a gallery of hope and renewal. One evening, as the sun set and the house was bathed in a golden glow, Emily danced in the garden. Her movements were a celebration of the life she was rebuilding, each step a declaration of her strength and determination. Michael sat on the porch, watching her with a sense of awe. "You've come so far, Emily," he called out, his voice filled with emotion. Emily paused, turning to face him. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. Michael shook his head. "You've done this, Emily. I'm just here to support you." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She walked over to Michael and took his hand. "Thank you for believing in me." Michael squeezed her hand gently. "Always." As the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, they sat together, sharing a quiet moment of connection and gratitude. Emily knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had found a place of safety and love, a place where she could truly flourish. The envelope lay on the kitchen table, its presence a dark cloud over the otherwise sunny morning. Emily stared at it, the familiar handwriting on the front making her stomach churn. Michael walked in, his face softening when he saw Emily's troubled expression. "Another letter from Carol?" he asked gently, already knowing the answer. Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. She picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in her hands, then set it back down with a sigh. "You don't have to read it, you know," Michael said, his tone steady and supportive. "You're not obligated to let her words affect you." Emily looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the internal struggle. "I know, but it's hard to ignore. She's still a part of my past, even if I don't want her to be." Michael placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Your past doesn't define your future, Emily. You have the power to choose what to carry forward." His words sank in, and Emily took a deep breath. "You're right," she said, feeling a surge of determination. "I'm not going to let her control my feelings anymore." With a decisive motion, she picked up the letter and threw it into the trash. The act felt liberating, a small but significant step towards reclaiming her peace. Michael smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's my girl," he said softly. "Let's focus on the present and the future, on all the beautiful things you're creating." Emily nodded, her resolve strengthening. She threw herself into her hobbies with renewed vigor, spending hours in the dance studio perfecting her routines and pouring her emotions into her paintings. Each brushstroke and dance step became a testament to her resilience and growth. One evening, as the golden light of sunset filtered through the windows, Emily approached Michael with a large canvas in her hands. "I have something for you," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Michael looked up from his book, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "What is it?" Emily turned the canvas around, revealing a beautifully painted scene of the two of them in the garden, surrounded by flowers. The colors were vibrant, the details intricate, capturing the essence of their bond perfectly. "It's us," Emily said, her eyes shining. "I wanted to give you something that shows how much you mean to me, how much you've helped me." Michael's breath caught in his throat as he took in the painting. "Emily, it's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. This means more to me than you could ever know." They shared a long hug, the painting a symbol of the journey they had taken together, from pain to healing, from fear to love. It was a tangible reminder of the family they had become. A few days later, they decided to take a walk in the nearby park, a favorite spot of theirs. The trees rustled gently in the breeze, and the sound of children playing in the distance added a cheerful backdrop to their stroll. Emily held Michael's hand, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip. As they walked, Emily looked up at Michael, her heart full. "I'm really happy, you know," she said quietly. Michael smiled down at her, his eyes reflecting the same contentment. "I'm happy too, Emily. You've come so far, and I'm so proud of you." They found a bench and sat down, watching the world go by. Emily leaned her head on Michael's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Emily closed her eyes, feeling the love and kindness that surrounded her. It was a journey from darkness to light, and she was ready for whatever the future held, knowing she was never alone. Thank you for following this touching story. The story about Emily, though full of challenges and pain, ultimately proves that God always blesses good people. We see that everything happens for a reason, and through those difficulties, Emily found happiness. Always believe that when you live well and patiently, happiness will come to you. Remember, every challenge in life is a stepping stone to something better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any meaningful stories. Thank you, and see you in the next videos.